If you want to learn how to play chess, then this is the video for you. I will show you how to set up the board and all the different rules of chess, like how the pieces move, pawn promotion, en passant, castling, checkmate, stalemate, etc. I will teach you everything about chess. At the same time, I will try to keep this video as simple as possible so that everyone can understand. You need to remember that the chessboard needs to be placed in such a manner that each player has the light colored square on the bottom right hand side. Regarding the pieces, the second row for each side is filled with pawns, just like this. And the first row should be set up as follows. The rooks belong to the corner squares, and now moving inward, the knights belong next to the rooks. Yes, this is called a knight and not a horse. Then next to the knights we have our bishops. After this we place our queens on her matching color, which means the white queen goes on a white square and the black queen goes on a black square. And then finally we place the king on the remaining square. If the board is set up correctly, each piece will be facing one another. The queen across the queen and the king across the king. That's how it should be. The player with the white pieces always moves first and makes one move, and then black makes one move. Each player will make alternate moves like this until the game ends. Each of the 6 different pieces have a unique way of moving. Let's start with the piece which is the easiest to understand, and that's the rook. The rook moves in a plus pattern just like this, which means it can move any number of squares either up, down, left or right as highlighted in this position. Rooks can capture the first enemy piece they move into. When you capture an enemy piece in chess, you simply go to the square it occupies and remove it from the board. Now let's talk about bishops. The bishops can move diagonally any number of squares or in an X pattern just like this. From this position, it can go to any of the squares I have highlighted in red. Bishops can capture the first enemy piece they move into. Now let's look at the queen. The queen is considered the most powerful piece on board because it can move both like the rook and bishop, which means it can move any number of squares vertically, horizontally or diagonally. From this position, the queen can go to any of these squares highlighted in red. The queen can capture the first enemy piece it moves into. Let's talk about the knights now. The knight moves in the shape of an L, moving 2 squares in one direction except diagonal and then 1 square just like that. The knight from this position can move to any of the squares highlighted in red. The knight is the only piece that can jump over other pieces, meaning if there were any pieces here right next to the knight, he can simply jump over those pieces and move. If there is any opponent piece on these highlighted squares, he can capture them. Now let's talk about the pawns. The pawn is actually the most complicated piece because it has many unique qualities. A pawn is the only piece that moves in one direction and captures in a completely different direction. Pawns move one step forward towards the opponent's side of the board. But if it is their first move, then they can move either 1 square forward like this or 2 squares forward like this. After its first move, the pawn can only move 1 square forward. So let's just say this pawn moves 2 squares and this pawn moves 1. Each of these highlighted pawns now could only move 1 square forward. Now if white moves his pawn 2 squares forward like this and black also goes 2 squares, you might be thinking that this white pawn can now capture this black pawn. But he cannot. Like I told you earlier, pawns move one way and capture in a different way. Remember, pawns can only capture pieces diagonally in front of them, and they cannot capture pieces directly in front of them. In fact, this pawn simply cannot move or capture. He is stuck and has no legal moves. However, this pawn does. This pawn can move forward like this, or he can capture 1 square diagonally like this. Now you know that pawns only move forward and they never move backwards. But what's going to happen if this pawn gets all the way down to this back rank or row, or if any of these black pawns get down to this back rank? Well, what happens is something called pawn promotion, and what that means is that the pawn simply turns into a queen, rook, bishop or a knight. You can promote it to any of these 4 pieces, it's completely your choice. Now let's talk about the most important piece, and that is our king. The objective of chess is to checkmate the king. The king is priceless because if you lose the king, you simply lose the game. The king moves 1 square at a time in any direction. From this position, he can go to any of these squares highlighted in red. Whenever a move results in the opponent's king being threatened, then the attacking player must say check. So the term check simply refers to the king being attacked. For example, in this position it's black to move, and if the rook goes to e8, then the white king is in check. He is being attacked and he needs to do something about it. When you are in check, there are three ways you can try to get out of it. You can try to move to a safe square, or block the check, or simply capture the checking piece. In this position, white can do all three. He can move to a safe square. All of these squares I have highlighted are safe. The king can move to any of these. You can also block the check, and by block, I mean to place a piece in between the checking piece and the king. Here you can block the check with your bishop, just like this. Or you can capture the checking piece, like this. So again, from this position, white can do all three of those. He can move to a safe square, block the check, or capture the checking piece. If you are in check and there is no way to protect the king, then the attacking player declares checkmate. The game is over and he wins. For example, in this position, if the black rook moves to h1, white is checkmate. He is in checkmate because he cannot move away to a safe square, he cannot block the check, and he cannot capture the checking piece as well. He cannot go to any of these three squares because the black king guards them. He cannot go to any of these two squares because the black rook guards them. The bishop is not in a position to capture the rook, and nor is the bishop in a position to block the check. For these reasons, the king is in checkmate and the game is over. Sometimes a chess game can also end in a draw. Let's first look at a draw by stalemate. In this position, if the queen moves to g3, this is considered a stalemate position or a drawn position. Stalemate occurs under the following conditions. It's your turn to move, your king is not in check, and you have no legal moves for any of your pieces. In this position, it's white to move, white is not in check, and has no legal moves. All three of these squares are covered by the black queen, and this pawn is also not able to move. This is an example of a stalemate position. Now the game can also be drawn by insufficient material. If it's a king and a knight versus a king, there's no way to win and the game is drawn. Similarly, if it's a king versus a king and a bishop, this too is a draw. And of course, if we are down to just king versus king, the kings cannot move next to each other and the game is a draw. Now let's talk about the 50 move rule. This is a position neither side is likely to win and a draw is usually agreed upon. However, even if the game continues, the game will most likely still end as a draw, but this time by the 50 move rule. The 50 move rule basically states that if both players make 50 consecutive moves each without making any pawn moves or any captures, the game ends as a draw. A game could also be drawn by threefold repetition, which means that if the exact same position is repeated 3 times during the game, then the game is declared as a draw. For example, in this position, it's white to move. Take a note of the pieces. This is the first time we are seeing this particular arrangement. After white moves, then black plays the bishop, and white goes back like this, and black goes back. This is now the second instance of the exact same position. And if it happens one more time, after a few moves, just like this, then this is the third instance of the same position, and hence, the game is drawn by threefold repetition. Now let's talk about some special rules in chess. The first one is a special pawn rule, en passant. In this position, it's black to move. And if this pawn moves 1 square forward, we can capture it since pawns capture 1 square diagonally. This same pawn, instead of going 1 square, let's say it goes 2 squares forward, trying to avoid this pawn from capturing it. Well then, we have the en passant rule which says that we still have the option of capturing the black pawn as if it had moved only 1 square forward. We have that option on our very next turn only, otherwise we lose that right altogether. So in this position, the white pawn can still capture the black pawn as if it had only moved 1 square forward. Now this is a special rule involving the pawns only and no other piece. If black plays this pawn and white doesn't capture immediately and instead plays this, and then black also makes some other move, now white can no longer capture en passant because you have to capture it on your very next turn only, or you can't do it at all. There's also a special move in chess called castling, and it involves the king and the rook. It's the only time you can move 2 of your pieces in one turn. Here's what it looks like. In this position, white can move the king 2 squares towards the h rook, and the rook is now going to be placed on the other side right next to the king. That's king side castling. Now similarly, if the king moves 2 squares towards the A rook and the rook is placed on the other side of the king, right next to it, just like that, that's queenside castling. Now there are a couple of conditions which must be met in order to castle successfully. It must be the king's first move, it must be that rook's first move, and there should not be any pieces in between the king and the rook. Those are just a couple of the basic conditions. However, there are 2 more conditions. In this position, black rook is on e5 and the white king is in check. And when you are in check, you cannot castle out of check. That is one rule that you must follow. Here's another one. You also cannot castle through check. In this position, for example, white cannot castle queenside since the rook is controlling this square. So you need to remember both these conditions. You cannot castle when you are in check and you cannot castle through check. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions on the rules of chess. Also let me know if I have missed out on something. Hit the thumbs up if you like this video and don't forget to subscribe for more such chess videos.